As you may
Brian
know,
Deese,
Brian was Senior Advisor to President
he will
Obama.
be,
As you may know,
acting director of the
Brian was
Office
Senior
of
Advisor to President
Management
Obama
and
and Budget,
served as acting
and in the
director of
Obama
the
Biden
Office of
administration, Management
helped
and Budget, and in the Obama Biden administration, Brian helped coordinate policy development for tax policy, housing, clean energy, manufacturing, and the automotive industry. Brian has agreed to come despite having the unenviable task of not being able to roll out many details of our joint session speech or the American Families Plan, but we still wanted to have him here to provide some context on some of the questions you all had raised. And he'll only be able to take a couple questions, but with that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Jen, and it's good to see you all again. So I wanted to just provide a little bit of context around, in particular, capital gains taxes, and we'll provide just a little bit of context, and then happy to take a couple of questions. So, as you know, and as Jen has spoken about, the president is excited to this week lay out his plan to invest in American families. It will be a plan that will provide critical support for children and families, and by doing so, critical support for our economy. By boosting labor force participation and future economic competitiveness, making among the most cost-effective measures to boost our long-term economic strength that we know of. And the president will also outline ways to offset the long-term costs of those investments by making reforms to our tax code that reward work and not just wealth. And one element of this reform will be to change how we tax capital gains. As you all know, that's income from selling stocks and other assets for taxpayers that make more than $1 million per year in income. So I want to start by reinforcing who this change will actually affect. This change will affect taxpayers making more than $1 million a year. In 2018, 0.3% of tax filers made more than $1 million a year. So I want to start by underscoring this in simple terms. This change will only apply to 0.3% of taxpayers, which is not the top 1%. It's not even the top 0.5%. We're talking about 0.3%. That's about 500,000 households in the country that we're talking about. So for the other 997 out of 1,000 households in the country, or the other 150 million households in the country, this is not a change that will be relevant. It won't change the tax treatment of capital gains at all. And this makes sense because for the typical Americans, most of their income comes from wages. So for people making less than $1 million a year, about 70% of their income comes from wages. But for those making more than $1 million, for the top 0.3%, it's the opposite. About 30% of their wages come from wages. And that's probably actually an understatement, since the wealthiest can often strategically avoid reporting this type of income entirely. And so as a result, this is the provision that since 2000, if you look at the 1,400 tax filers, those are people making over $60 million a year. That's the, for those of you keeping track, that's the top 1,000th of 1%. They have only paid about 20% of their reported income in taxes. So their tax rate, which probably is overstated, again, because this is the category that often doesn't report or underreports income. Their tax rate is lower than many middle-class families' tax rate. This is the dynamic that led Warren Buffett to famously explain that he paid a lower tax rate than his secretary. And it is the dynamic that has led the president and others to argue that we need to do something about equalizing the taxation of work and wealth in this country. And that's why the reforms that the president will lay out are focused on this top sliver of people and treating capital gains the same as wages for that top 0.3%. And we believe that it's not only fair, but it would also help to reduce the kinds of tax avoidance that significantly undermines trust and fairness in the tax code itself. And importantly, the revenue from this provision would help invest directly in our kids and our families and our future economic competitiveness, and put us in a position where we can drive greater economic growth. So we'll have more to say on this and how it fits into the overall plan, but I just wanted to re-underscore at the top that number one, we're talking about a tax change that would affect, again, the 0.3%, the top sliver of households. And number two, the principle here is to equalize the treatment of ordinary income and capital gains. And that is a principle that's neither new nor particularly novel. In fact, the last president to enact a reform to equalize the treatment of ordinary income and capital gains was President Reagan, who did so while raising capital gains taxes as part of the 1986 tax reform. And of course, we will be raising higher rates than in that reform. But a lot has changed in the economy since then. A lot has changed in the academic and empirical research in this space. But the principle is the same, which is that for the very highest income Americans, we should tax at the same rate ordinary income and capital gains. So with that, when I pause and could take a couple of questions.
Thanks so much for doing this, Brian. Just to make sure I understand this, critics say that you tax capital gains at lower rates to incentivize investments that help the economy grow. Is the administration's perspective that among these high earners, they have not been making the investments to help the economy and that the government programs can do it better?
So, across a wide body of academic and empirical evidence, there is no evidence of a significant impact of capital gains rates on the level of long-term investment in the economy. If you look back over the last 30 or 40 years, we've had capital gains rates at various rates. We've seen different levels of investment and overall economic growth. You can't identify a meaningful correlation between the two. There's lots of reasons for that, including that if you look at where a lot of venture capital and early stage investment comes from, it actually comes from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, entities that actually are not tax sensitive. Also because at the end of the day, a lot of things go into making an investment decision. But certainly our view and reading of the evidence is that there's not a correlation that would significantly affect investment for these highest income individuals, number one. And number two, we can use those resources to invest in areas that we know where there is convincing academic evidence, empirical evidence, that investments, for example, in early childhood and in our children return enormous dividends in terms of their own academic success, reduced costs in the healthcare system, productivity, and growth in the future.
Catherine?